for inviting me, Sarah, and CMA. So I'd like to talk to you about the role of estuaries in the life histories of fish and how important that is in these sorts of systems in particular. Firstly, I'd just like to really talk about, just give you an overview of the types of fish that inhabit estuaries, and then go through the life cycles of three key species, I suppose, in the system, and that illustrate these life histories and how important estuaries are to them. And then also talk more generally about the sort of nature of estuaries, and lastly, just to finish on some of the ideas, I suppose, about how ecology can assist, the science of ecology can assist the management of estuaries. Sarah introduced me briefly, which thanks for that, and I just thought I'd give you a little bit more background on my background. So I studied at the University of Adelaide and completed a Master's of Science there with research. I've been working as Lloyd Environmental for a long time now, but prior to that worked at State Water Lab, working across Victoria, and also prior to that the Department of Environment. I think it was called Conservation, Forests and Lands when I worked there, but that was about 6, 7, 8 name changes ago. I'm also an honorary research fellow at Fed's Uni. And I've worked extensively in the southwest, but unfortunately not in the Curdies. But I have been looking at a lot of the information on the Curdies. So in terms of the types of fish that are found, there's I suppose, a conceptual model about the types of fish based on their usages, their use of the estuary. So there's really 6 different I suppose types of fish. There are freshwater fish which opportunistically come down from the top of the catchment into the estuary and opportunistically use the resources there. There are also a group of fish called estuarine dependent fish from that freshwater. They live most of their life in freshwater, but they come and use the estuary for one purpose or other in their life cycle. There's also estuarine residents, and they are exactly as they sound. They live in the estuary and nowhere else. There's also fish that are estuarine dependent, but they come from the marine environment. And then there's also estuarine opportunists from the marine environment, and also marine stragglers that occasionally occur there. So in the Curdies, the interesting thing is that when you use that typology, you can really look at how important those different groups of fish are, so that the freshwater opportunists, for instance, there's only 2 species that occur within the estuary, or roughly 2. There could well be other species that I'm not aware of, but they're not a major part of this particular estuary. Whereas, excuse me, the estuarine dependent fish, there's 3 different species, 2 galaxids and the short fin eel. And I'll talk about one of those galaxids later in a bit more detail, the common galaxis, that's why it's highlighted. The estuarine resident fish are obviously very important to estuaries. They live their whole life cycle in estuaries, and what happens in the estuary really determines their fate over the whole time frame. So black bream is the obvious large recreational fish species there, but there's also estuary perch. And there are smaller fish that people may not have heard of, such as the smallmouth hardyhead and blue spot goby. Another group is that estuarine dependent marine fish, and there's obviously some quite important species there in terms of King George whiting, mulloway, and two of the mullet species. And then, of course, the marine opportunists, or the estuarine opportunists that come from the marine environment, And again, there's a large percentage of those, and they just come into the estuary when it's open and really exploit the resources that occur within the estuary. But it obviously has an important component to their life, but it's not critical. So just going back to describing, I suppose, some of the roles of the of those different fish groups. The first one here, if we start in the top of the catchment, and we've got an example here of an eel, they live most of their life in fresh waters, and they live a long time, 20, 30 or more years. And they then move out, in fact, through the estuary to the sea. They spawn, their larvae then recruit and then swim back into the estuary, and they spend their whole life, most of their life, then swimming upstream, growing and maturing. The estuarine resident, as I said before, spends its whole life within the estuary, breeding, recruiting as juveniles, and then growing up as adults. They may well move out of the estuary and back in for very brief amounts of time, or to move from estuary to estuary. But they, as a rule, require quite specific conditions, and the black bream is one of those. So we'll come back to black bream. The estuarine-dependent fish from the marine environment, they may well breed, and largely do, in the marine environment, but near the estuarine, and they'll move back in as either larvae or juveniles, and then they grow up in the estuarine environment before then undertaking a migration to do that. And then for the marine opportunists, they spend most of their life cycle breeding, growing, recruiting and growing in the marine environment, but then when opportunities occur, they can come into that estuarine environment and exploit things there. So, so then sort of, I suppose, coming back to I suppose from the marine side of things, the King George whiting is a really important estuarine-dependent species. They breed in marine waters, and in fact, they travel from Victoria over into the southeast of South Australia and breed, and then migrate back along the coast and recruit into estuaries, particularly around seagrasses, and but also other structures that might be protecting them, such as reeds and so forth. And they grow, and then they eventually move into the open waters within the estuary, and then they move out to sea to breed, I suppose, thereby completing that life cycle. The black bream, as we said before, spends its whole life cycle in the estuarine environment. And in fact, they'll move quite a way upstream, depending on the flow conditions. So in low flows, they'll move upstream to exploit those freshwater conditions. And they require quite specific requirements, conditions, I should say, to breed. They breed on what's called the salt wedge at salinities around 15 to 20, whereas the seawater is somewhere around 30, 35. The black bream eggs remain suspended in the water column, and then after a couple of days they hatch and the larvae recruit or settle into seagrass beds or phragmites. And again, they mature into juvenile fish and then grow into adults. As I said, they may well move from estuary to estuary. The common galaxid has a very different life cycle to both of those. They live most of their life, like the eels, upstream in the freshwater environments. And when they mature, they'll move down to the estuaries, generally with the trigger of a flow. and they'll move down to the estuaries. They actually lay their eggs on areas that are inundated under quite high spring tides in the samphire and the wetlands, and the eggs can be slightly desiccated for a while, and then they can get rehydrated and hatch out, and then recruit into the estuary itself, and then with some flows are washed out to sea, generally near in the sort of marine environment near the mouth of the estuary, and then they'll come back into the estuary, grow, and then move up into the freshwater to spend the rest of their lives. So, but the eels have a very similar life cycle, but they move out into the ocean to breed. So with all of that information, that they're sort of conceptual models that work at the very high level, but each of those is accompanied by a series of texts and research that has been undertaken over many years, and that we try to summarise that information. And you're not meant to read this slide, by the way, but we use that in a summary sense to really pull out of that conceptual model some of the key information that we need to help manage the species, or help manage in particular environmental flows. So the information on the common jolly tail out of that conceptual model provides us really 4 lots of information. The first one is that flows are needed, low flow freshers in particular, which is a component, a flow component, to allow the longitudinal connection in the channel to allow the jolly tails to move downstream into the estuary. The flows also, or larger flows generally, are required to open the mouth to allow downstream migration of the larvae. And then also in the winter, larger flows open the mouth again to allow those juveniles to migrate back up into the estuary again, and then the freshwater. And obviously freshwater, flow freshers are required to inundate the benches and also those floodplain areas for the fish to breed upon, and then also actually it stimulates invertebrate production for their feeding. So that's a very important part of their life cycle. So by using these conceptual models, we can extract out information for management of the system. I should keep going. Sorry, I needed some water. So yeah, one of the important things is really the diversity of habitats within estuaries, so that at the macro scale, on my left, maybe yours, we've got things such as the riverine channel, the estuarine wetlands, the estuarine lagoon, and the sand berm are all important habitats within the system. But at the micro scale, we've got open water, vegetation, woody debris, undercut banks, again, are very important for the range of species to be, I suppose, catered for. The other sorts of dynamics we see is also within the salt wedge, and this is probably getting fairly close to Sarah McSweeney's work in some senses, but just really the important thing is that this is actually outputs of a model on the Gellibrand River, showing you the blue is the freshwater, and going through to the red being the seawater, red and white. And you can see that on the outflowing tide, there's not very much salt in the water at all, whereas on the spring tides, the salt water pushes up a lot further. So, excuse me. And so that dynamics is really important. And as I said before, that this is called the salt wedge, and that salt wedge is very important for a number of fish, in particular the black brim, for their breeding. And there's a whole range of different water sources for the estuary. There's the catchment flows coming down the system. There's groundwater in some estuaries. There's obviously flooding from those catchment flows out into the estuarine wetlands. There's also marine exchange both ways, and also mixing within the estuary itself. And that's really important for introducing oxygen, nutrients, and also moving sediments from the system as well. And I know Sarah is going to talk about that a lot. One of the things that occur in estuaries sometimes is blue-green algal blooms, and one occurred in the Curdies last year. And that was interesting because it actually was made up of both saline-tolerant blue-green algae, nodularia, and 2 freshwater blue-green algae, algal species. And they were very high biovolumes, so the actual amount of algae recorded was very high, something like 5 times the reporting limit. And actually, the second one is meant to be reporting limit for toxic blue-green algae. So as you can see, that's something like more than 10 times the reporting level. So, but I suppose the thing we need to know about blue-green algal blooms is that they are natural events. They occur under natural circumstances, and the first one that was recorded was 1878 in Lake Alexandrina, which caused death of stock and pets. But I think across Australia, the frequency has increased as we've altered the landscape. And really, I suppose the message is, and we'll probably hear about this a bit later during the day, is that controlling blue-green algal blooms really starts with catchment management to really look after those sources of nutrients and sediments. We can also use conceptual models to highlight our understanding of the what drives, I suppose, blue-green algal blooms. And so we do know that there are certain triggers, in particular low flows, high sediment loads, and nutrient runoff, and also the lack of riparian vegetation, which helps filtering. And that causes a range of different stressors in the estuary. So stratification, reduced mixing, we have increased surface temperatures. We also get nutrient streaming from the sediments, particularly if the sediments are deoxygenated. And also during wind events, we can actually have the sediment stirred up, which then releases additional sediments, additional nutrients. And that then results in an algal bloom. The deoxygenation can then cause loss of biodiversity. But again, really the issue is not whether a bloom is occurring, it's really how frequently they are occurring. And my understanding in the Curdies is that that bloom last year was the first that was recorded. So maybe they're a rare event, which is you know, a good thing. I suppose I just wanted to, I've got a couple of slides to end up on in terms of really just highlighting what some of the estuary requirements are. And we've spoken about this earlier, so I'm really just summarising how important connectivity is for up and downstream movement of fish, and also lateral movement from the estuary lagoon to those floodplain areas, and also out through the mouth at times. The water quality is particularly important, so salinity and salt wedges, oxygen, but again, runoff with nutrients can be a negative, so we need to guard against that. And we spoke about the importance of complex and diverse habitat types, and I also spoke about how important flows are in the particular system. So that's so thanks very much. That's my talk, and yeah, we can talk about questions in the session, the discussion session afterwards.